Hi, this is Jeff Altman, the Big Game Hunter, and you're listening to Job Search Radio. I'm now going to switch voices now. I hope you enjoy this. So, good evening. I'm going to tell you a horror story tonight, boys and girls. The horror story is about resumes. You know, there are only one type of resume. Wrong. There's multiple resumes. We all know about chronological resumes and functional resumes. And now I'm going to tell you a story about a resume type that some of you really need to use. A resume for the federal government of the United States. I'm going to switch back. Such resumes are completely different. And I have a great guest today who's going to teach you about the differences, how to construct one. So if you're applying for a job with the U.S. government, they'll tell you exactly where to go and how to write a resume. So hang in there. Enjoy the show. I hope you enjoyed my Boris Karloff accent there. And together, let's sing along.
Are you looking for a new job or interested in leveling up? Job Search Radio is your go-to resource for insider tips on job hunting and growing your career. Here's your host, Jeff Altman.
So my guest on this week's show is LaTanya F. Moore, Esquire, attorney, entrepreneur, and coach with more than 15 years of employment experience and a specialty in federal employment. LaTanya provides services to private clients on all things federal job hunting. LaTanya, welcome to Job Search Radio. Great to have you here.
Jeff, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate this opportunity.
You're very welcome. So, federal resumes, civilian resumes, private sector resumes. Why are we talking about this? What the hell is the difference between a federal resume and a private sector resume? Let's put it that way.
The biggest difference, Jeff, is that in the private sector, the typical rule of thumb is the one-page resume. So you have to sort of encapsulate everything into just a couple of bullet points. On the federal resume, they want to know absolutely everything. So they want to know who you are, how long you worked there. They want to know what your last salary was, who is your supervisor, what's your supervisor's phone number, can they contact the supervisor, and they want to know every single detail of what you did in a particular job, which, of course, as you know, is drastically different from the private sector resume, where they just need a quick overview so that they can make a decision about whether or not they're going to give you an interview.
That must be torture to formulate. You think about every supervisor, every detail, every bit of minutia known to man or womankind in a document. How long do these things wind up being?
Well, it's not that bad, but I'll tell you, when I was a federal employee, so for example, my sample federal resume, which is my personal federal resume, is about 6 pages long. Now, for me, it's 6 pages long because, for example, I worked for one agency and I had multiple positions within that agency. So again, you have to put a lot of detail. It could be long. It sounds like it's very tedious, but I don't want to turn off the viewers and the listeners because it's really not. It's just a matter of being strategic in how you present the information.
Okay. So in the traditional civilian resume, we've got the typical header, name, address, the city, state, zip code, phone numbers, email address. Any difference there?
No, but there is an addition. An addition is whether or not you are seeking a specific region or geographical area. Are you looking to move? Are you flexible? Things of that nature. And the difference, Jeff, is that a lot of these things are asked up front. But as you know, when you move along the interview process in any sector, sometimes they ask you those things. So it's not that the information is irrelevant. It's just that you have to provide a lot of that information up front.
Interesting. I never would have thought of that as a necessity, but okay, that's the way the rules work.
Oh, I'm sorry. One other thing I definitely need to add is they do ask you for your social security number, not your birth date, but your social security number. You must be willing to disclose that on your federal resume.
Ouch. Especially given the hacks that have taken place in federal systems. Yeah, okay, that's the way the rule is. That's the way it goes. So we've got that header done. Where does someone go to from there? How do they begin providing that information flow so that someone examining it, and I'm going to check, is there an applicant tracking system or are there human beings looking at this point?
Well, it starts out with the applicant tracking system, and that's through usajobs.gov. Again, that's usajobs.gov, and that particular system is maintained through the Office of Personnel Management. That's the first step. After you get past the applicant tracking system, then there are individuals that check for the people that make it through that layer. There are actually staffing specialists at the respective agencies that will check to make sure that your credentials do match that particular job that you're applying for.
Gotcha. So I'm going to detour a little bit off the resume because I always have this thing about applicant tracking systems. So in the private sector, when you submit a resume to an ATS, the idea is to get the relevant data as early in the document as possible so that this way the system believes it's more current work. And since so many of these systems have been programmed with data dictionaries that are looking for these particular keywords for a job, they like to see it more recently so that this way they think it's current. Is the same thing true in the federal systems as well?
Yes, it's similar. However, the federal system requires that you present your job information in a reverse chronological order. So your most recent job experience is going to be up front anyway.
Okay, good. Great. I'm just trying to make sure of this. So we've got the header here, and we're starting to get into the body of the resume. Private sector, if someone has a degree or an advanced degree, education tends to go there next. Is that true for the federal resume?
Well, it depends. And the clients that I coach privately about this, it really depends on where they are in their career. So, for example, my advice to a new person entering the workforce or a person entering a new field would be different from a person that's seasoned in a particular category of jobs. So what does that mean, LaTanya?
Hey, I can just sit back now. This is great.
But what that means is that if you are a seasoned employee, I would suggest that you do something like a summary of qualifications. And that encapsulates everything that you've done in an overview standpoint at the very top so that they'll know, okay, they have 15 years of experience doing this or 14 years or 10 years versus a person who they're right out of college. So their particular degree and course of study is what's going to get them through the door initially.
So just a detour with the seasoned person for a second. With that summary, sometimes in the private sector, people are encouraged to use like a cover letter that has like the T-square formula, the requirement of the position in one column, and in effect fundamentally what the person's done and for how long that relates to that to the right. And it could be 8 or 9 different qualifications. Is that useful in the summary area, or should they just think in terms of, okay, let's just put the bullet points of what I've done that relates to this job right in there?
No, it's very useful. And what I always tell people is that in your summary, only utilize or summarize the information that is important for that particular position. That's very important in the federal sector. You really just need to use the information that's just important because remember, the resume is already much longer than a standard private sector resume. So you want to make sure that you don't have a 15-page resume and a 2-page summary of qualifications.
Beautiful. We're making a lot of progress here. I'm starting to get the difference. So we've got this summary that's really targeted to the specific job. Now, if someone were applying to multiple positions, would they be still using, let's say from that point on, the same resume and just changing summaries to demonstrate the fit? Or is it really going to be completely customized for every single job you apply for on the federal level?
Okay.
I knew it was going to be a toughie.
Well, but if you're applying for a job if all of your applications are going to a job under one series, for example, which is just a class of jobs, typically those requirements are going to be the same. And so you're just going to tweak, for example, you'll tweak the summary of qualifications if you're going for a supervisory versus a non-supervisory position, of course. If you're applying for jobs in multiple series, then you definitely want to make sure that you completely tweak that area for a specific category of jobs.
Terrific. I'm sorry to take you off on these tangents, but my mind keeps going in this way because I'm comparing the two types of resume. And as you know, in the private sector, people are coached to tailor a complete resume to each individual job. But since that federal resume is offering so much more information, I was thinking that maybe that summary area be the one place that they could zero in on to highlight particular parts of their background.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we're going to be back with more from LaTonya in just a moment, but first my job search insider tip for this show, which is, sometimes you're going to accept a position and you're going to realize pretty quickly, maybe I made the wrong decision here. Maybe this is not the job I was told it was. And what do? Your dream job is turned into a nightmare is what we're talking about. So the first thing I would suggest doing right off the bat is, number one, speak with some of your colleagues and see if this is the norm for the role, or whether this just happens to be a particularly stressful or unusual time. Sometimes you discover, as someone told me about a few weeks ago, they were the fifth person sitting in that chair in 8 months. There's a message in that, quite obviously, that they withheld. So, that's different than, no, this is unusual. So if it is unusual, then go to your boss and just simply say, hey, I understand things are a little different right now. There's some stuff going on. How long do you think this is going to run? So that helps to manage your anxiety and manage your expectations. And if you discover, lo and behold, that this is what the norm is going to be because they forgot to tell you about that reorg that put the group into a different place in the organization, well, maybe it's time to dust off the resume pretty quickly. And when you go out and interview, don't badmouth the employer. Just simply say, something seemed to shift not long after I joined. It's not the role that I was told it was going to be. Business happens, but yes, business happens for me too. I don't want to sit here and go through this. It doesn't serve my professional needs, and it's not the work I bargained for. So that's my tip for this show. If you like it, there's a lot more on my website, which again is thebiggamehunter.us. Visit the site, go exploring, particularly in the blog. There's a lot more there that'll help you, that you can watch, listen to, or read. So let's come back to LaTonya and pick up where we left off. So far we've gotten through this summary because I ask a lot of questions. And where do we go to from here? What's the next step in the process?
Well, what I would suggest, again, it again depends on where you are in your career. A more seasoned person, I believe, can go right into their experience. They have the summary, so that's going to get the staffing specialist excited into reading. Well, okay, let me see the details of what this person has done. So you're going to move right into that. For a entry-level employee, or again, someone that's transitioning into another category of jobs, I would say go right into whatever it is that makes you qualified for this new endeavor or this new position. So for example, a student, they may lead with whatever their degree is. And they may have some pertinent courses that they've actually taken in school that applies to the job. A transitional person, they may have just gotten a new certification or something to that effect. That's what I would lead with if I were them.
So I'm going to leap in on the beginner. And obviously there are entry-level jobs in the federal sector. So are they laying out their coursework that's relevant as the typical private sector resume might, or internships? What would you suggest the beginner do to demonstrate qualifications?
Well, absolutely. If coursework is your strong suit, you definitely want to go there. If you have an internship, again, whether it's pertinent or not, it is valuable real world work experience versus a work study program. For example, if you have been a researcher or a research assistant with a professor that's doing something that's cutting edge or relevant to that particular position. All of that is very important information because they see that you have the experience in that particular subject matter.
Gotcha. Now, for the experienced individual, time to go into all that detail. Is there a format for the detail that the federal sector likes to see?
I would suggest bullet points because it makes it easier to read. It makes it easier to see when it gets to the staffing specialist. If you do a paragraph format, unfortunately, if you're talking about you've worked at a company for 12 years, those paragraphs can look a tad bit tedious. So you may want to do something that is going to make it easier for them to identify the relevant experience that they're seeking when they determine whether or not you're going to make it to the next level.
So my background is in private sector recruiting, and I've coached people for years, but ultimately a lot of what I do is help individuals find work. And in a private sector resume, they may have one role with an organization for 4 years and another one with that same one for 2 and one before that. And I heard you say before that, everything has to be disclosed. It has to all get laid out. So I'm wondering, how much more detail should someone do for the federal sector resume different than the private sector?
Well, again, I think it really helps. So let's use your example of someone who's worked with one company and they've had multiple roles. What I always tell my clients is that you don't really look at the roles. And again, this is for federal sector in terms of job date. You look at the day that you entered that company and the date that you left. So let's say you started with the company in 2005 and you're still there, and this is 2016. When on the federal resume, you'll put you started in 2005 to the present. And then you start with your most recent position. And what is it that you're doing there? And then you go, in reverse chronological order in those positions. Now, different people will say different things. So some people will say, well, you should list every single position that you've had. With my clients, it really depends. So, for example, if that's the only job that this person has had, for example, I would tend to tell them to list the different positions versus someone who have had multiple jobs or multiple positions outside of that company. I would say that you could actually just list some duties and responsibilities that you've had while working with this particular company.
Gotcha. So I'm trying to be as specific as possible here because that's my makeup. So in this example of someone with 10 years of experience, let's say they had 5 years before that. So what I heard you say is once they have some additional experience, maybe not quite as much of the detail for the federal resume as they might if this was their only job.
Yes,
do I have that right?
Absolutely. Because one other thing about the federal resume is they like to see accomplishments. So if there have been some major things that you've done, so for example, in the scenario that we're discussing right now, let's say that in those previous years, they received the top earner award, or they received the award for this or that. Those are some things that you can just encapsulate as accomplishments while working for this company. They may not even be in that same position, but it's a track record of success with this company.
So with this resume, there's a formula that I coach people to. I had an interview with a guy named Ron Nash, and we were talking about resumes and LinkedIn profiles. And it involves defining what the problem was that you were presented with, the action that you took, the result that took place as a result of your personal action. And then I tacked in this one other criteria called the metrics. Is there a way to measure the impact of what you did in terms of money saved, money earned, or how much better you were as an employee than the average? Is that a value on the federal resume as well?
It's a value, especially in jobs where there is a widget requirement. So, for example, if you need to collect, I was an attorney for the federal government for a little bit over 12 years, and the issue was less than, it wasn't about the number of cases that you closed. It was more about the quality of those closures from a time frame standpoint. So, for example, my numbers,
yes,
my numbers my percentages were very, very good with regard to keeping cases on the statutory scheduled time frames. That's something that's very valuable to the company or to the agency. And so those are the things that are very important. If you're a person because it's going to save money. I have no clue how much money that saved by being more efficient, because just from my position, that's just something that I wouldn't know. So I wouldn't be able to share that. However, I do know what my percentages are. For example, when I left the government, I had about an 89% closure rate for cases that were within the statutory time frame versus the average. And again, the average is a national average is about 67%. These are things that are very important because it shows efficiency, and it's something that you can provide the data if you have to.
Right. And that's that kind of metrics. And when Ron and I were talking, we used the example of the call center person. How do you measure what a call center person's dollar value is? You really can't. But what you can do is compare them with the typical one, or for the administrative assistant who is handling more calls by 18% than the average administrative assistant or receptionist. That's a measurement that can work. I don't know if there are places in public sector where you can measure revenue generated outside of internal revenue or money saved, but people can clearly use these kind of metrics like you did. Comparison with the mean about, as in your case, 89% versus 60 some odd percent as being a measure of efficiency. Nice, LaTonya. Why'd you leave the federal government?
Well, I'm doing my own thing. Sometimes you have to look at purpose, and you have to say, what is it that I was sent here to do when I was born? So that's what I'm pursuing. I'm pursuing my purpose. I'm pursuing my dream. I love all things labor, all things labor and employment for sure. But now I'm actually doing some other endeavors as well.
Thank you. I was just curious about that. Now let's come back to that resume. So we've got we're laying out the jobs there, and we're talking in terms of problems a person faced, the action that they took, minimally actions, because, I'm sure that in a case like yours, I'm not sure that it's appropriate to talk about problems. You can outline what your responsibilities were, and that you handled a particular type of caseload, what the results were, and of course the metrics, as we've been talking about. So I'm wondering, again, we're going to stick with this kind of formula. Is that the best thing to do?
Absolutely, because remember, we have a resume that could technically be an endless number of pages. So if you could take everything that you've done and put it into 1 or 2 bullet points about outcomes, measurements and outcomes, that's going to help tremendously as that resume gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Although the government wants to know a lot, no one wants to read a 20-page resume. So you still have to know that this resume eventually is going to fall into a human's hands. So you want to make sure that you're as efficient with the information, but you do have to disclose a lot more.
Cool. So with that, I'm wondering how we're getting up to 6 or 8 page resumes, because it's not sounding radically different than the private sector resume. So at the end of the day, how does it wind up being this long?
Well, because once people find out that they're supposed to include every single thing, they include every single thing. And so what I do is when I work with clients on how to structure their resume, the very first thing that I do is tell them, send me every single thing. And then what I do is I refashion their resumes to make it more efficient. Now, how does a resume, for example, like my resume gets to be 6 pages? There are several different things that, first of all, I worked for 4 different agencies while I was with the federal government, and all of my very first job was not directly an attorney job. And so that information, again, I had multiple hats. So I did investigations, I did training, I did mediations, I did all different types of things, which all had to be explained in terms of what that is. My attorney positions, again, they were all different. I worked for one federal agency where it was more of I hate to say it, but it's like a multiple practice area. It wasn't quite centralized. Then another agency I worked for, it was primarily labor and employment. And so for me, I had about 4 to 5 different practice areas for one particular job. So again, detail, we had to talk about the measurements, this metrics that you've talked about, and also the achievements. So my particular situation is a tad bit different possibly from others, but that's how my resume ended up being 6 pages, because I had to include all the other sections as well. My experience, I have several certifications. I've done a lot of, I want to keep my achievements on there because I want everybody to know. So those are things, again, that add to the length of my resume.
Gotcha. So let me use the example. Actually, let me detour again. I love these detours tonight. So a government worker, an existing one who's trying to change agencies, they're again working through USA.gov in order to apply for positions. Everyone, whether they're currently employed by the federal government or outside the federal government, is going through that portal, right?
Absolutely.
So from there, most of them already have gone through this once. So they have a sense of what the process is like. Any particular advice for government workers that are applying, or federal government workers that are applying through there who may have forgotten some things about how to apply?
Absolutely. What I would suggest I would suggest a couple of things. With the federal sector, there are different job categories and different pay classes and all of these things. But what I would say is that if you're going, for example, and federal sector employees will kind of get this a little bit. If you're going, for example, from a wage grade to a general schedule job, and a wage grade meaning it's a regular hourly job versus a salaried position, just, to sort of make it consistent with the private sector. If you're going from one to the other, typically your general schedule jobs are going to be your more professional jobs. Redo that old resume. A lot of times with the wage grade positions, they apply directly with the agency versus actually going through that process. So they could presently there are several ways to get a wage grade position that goes outside of this process. And I know that's outside of what we're talking about. However, that's a big difference and a big step. Also, for present federal employees that are going from a general schedule job to a senior executive service position, totally different process, totally different resume, totally different application materials. So again, you definitely have to know all of those different levels and the requirements of all of those different levels so that you can be competitive.
Super. And I know we're starting to come up on the end of time with one another for today, and there's so much more to cover. So for someone in private sector coming in, and they've now got the 8-page, Dostoevsky book, Tolstoy book, and they've got to edit it down. Where do you begin and edit?
Wow. I think for what I normally do, I always start with the experience. And I say, okay, how can I take this person's resume, or how can I take this person's job experience from 1 page to a half a page, for example? Is there any way to effectively cut it in half and they're still able to be competitive in the job? That's the very first thing that I look for when I work with clients. Sometimes you can't do that. So if I can't do that, then I look for other ways to cut that resume, to just cut that resume down as much as possible. And a lot of times it comes down to things like certifications. If it's a certification that is not relevant to either a class of jobs that they're looking for, or a particular job announcement that they're going to send that particular resume to, I have them take it off. So just anything that when it comes down to it, you don't necessarily need this right now. Those are the ways that I cut down that resume.
Cool. Now, as I said at the beginning, this is not my area of specialization. It's yours. So if I haven't asked you something today that we really need to cover, please let everyone know what that is so that my ignorance doesn't impact the interview. Well, what haven't I asked you about that we need to cover?
Well, one thing that I would really like to encourage your listeners who are military veterans, who have never worked for the federal government before, the easiest way to explain it is set-asides. You can actually apply for jobs with the federal government, just like any other federal employee. You get, in addition to that, there are 10-point, 20-point, and 30-point preferences that you get based on your veteran status. So what does that mean? That means when you go through this resume process that we've been talking about this entire time, and your resume materials, your application materials are scored, you will then get an extra 10 points, 20 points, or 30 points, depending on your eligibility status. That could be the difference between you being sent to a selecting official or not. The other thing I'd like to add is that if there is a choice between a veteran and a non-veteran, again, this is competitive service, but if there is a choice between a veteran and a non-veteran, the rule of thumb is that the veteran should be selected, but all things must be equal. And there are a lot of people that do not know this. And so if you are a veteran and you have applied for a job and you feel that your veteran's preference or something like that has not been taken into account, there are ways that you can seek to rectify that.
Should they put their veteran status early in the resume?
Absolutely. It goes right up top with your header. You need to put it right up there with your header, whether or not you're a veteran or not.
Super. LaTonya, thank you so much for making time today. How can folks find out more about you and the work that you do?
Well, thank you for having me, Jeff. They can reach out. My company is called Opulence Enterprises. We're at www.opcoach.tv. That's www.opcoach.tv. They can also reach me by email. They can reach me at opulencetv@gmail.com. Again, that's opulencetv@gmail.com.
Beautiful. LaTonya, again, thank you. And folks, I'll be back next time with someone else to help you find work more quickly. I'm Jeff Altman, the Big Game Hunter. I want to mention that if you need help, if you want your job search to go more smoothly, reach out to me for coaching. I'm available, a lot of hours every day, but you can find out about my coaching work at my website, thebiggamehunter.us. There's a tab on top that'll direct you. And if you just have a few questions or one big one, again, there's a tab on top that says have your job search questions answered. I'd be very happy to help you. Hope you enjoyed today's show. Hope you have a great day. Take care.
For more job search advice, visit Jeff's website at thebiggamehunter.us. That's thebiggamehunter.us.